Aloha, everybody. Hi, I think it's Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. Um, so, we are going to be discussing the book The Body Keeps the Score today for our mental health book club for May. Um, and this book is by Bessel Kolk, and it's a pretty intense book, to be honest. Obviously, the topic itself is intense. We're talking about trauma. And so if at any point, this does feel like the information is too much, feel free to step away and come back to it. I know for me personally, even just reading the book, there were parts of the book that I had to put down at times and come back to, just because it has some pretty, intense content. But part of why I chose this book is because I really resonate with the idea that in order to heal trauma, that actually we need to essentially learn how to engage the body. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is we'll talk a little bit about what trauma is, and then some strategies and healing techniques that he discusses in the book to heal trauma. And so it is pretty heady, there is a lot of science to it. I personally am fascinated by the neuroscience of it. But here we go. We'll just kind of dive right in. And so, the first question that I put out there for our book club was, what is trauma, right? And how does he define it? And so Bessel van der Kolk actually worked with veterans, and he was working with veterans that were living with PTSD. And originally before his work, he was, we were defining trauma as exposure to these extraordinary events that sort of happen outside of the normal human experience. But what he realized through his work is actually, one, that trauma is so common, sadly. But he basically redefined trauma as an event that he says overwhelms our central nervous system and basically alters the way that we process and recall memories. So he says it's not actually the event, yes, the trauma itself, that is the event that happens, but actually trauma has more to do with how you respond to it. It also has to do with who surrounds you and supports you after the trauma. And so there's a lot to say here. I mean, I think a big takeaway from the sort of beginning chapters of the book is, he's basically discussing how common trauma is, right? And I can share some statistics around that. They're fairly disturbing statistics. But I think the big takeaway is that more of us than we realize have experienced some sort of trauma in our lifetime. Many during childhood, and many in our adult life as well. So the thing though that stood out to me was that what he says is that one of the most significant protective factors against being traumatized, again, is who is there for you at that particular time. So if something traumatic happens, what he's saying basically is that if your relationships are intact, if you are feeling seen and heard and loved and supported by the people around you and protected actually after the trauma, that you're much more likely to be able to sort of rebound from that and manage that trauma in healthier ways. And he's also saying that trauma is a very subjective experience. So what's traumatic for one person may not be for another, right? Depending on a whole host of factors, including our personality, our prior experiences, and again, our support system. So that's part of it. The second sort of part of that question is really, we were talking about what is trauma, right? And what are common reactions to trauma? And one of the things that he breaks down in the book, and that I've studied as a licensed therapist, basically is that trauma affects us in so many ways. So if we've had a traumatizing experience, there are both cognitive but also behavioral, there are psychological, there's so many different ways that trauma impacts us. So I'm going to just break it down a little bit to talk about some of the ways that trauma, some of the common reactions to trauma. So sort of within our mind, right, trauma can obviously result in a whole host of different experiences and symptoms. So there might be, a person might experience intrusive thoughts following a trauma, right? These thoughts that are basically coming out of nowhere, and they just keep coming back in, whether that's sort of like a memory or a flashback or even a nightmare. The person may even just experience visual images of that. There's sometimes a loss of memory, right? And even concentration. Obviously confusion, disorientation, sometimes mood swings, right? I mean, trauma throws off our entire system, right? So that's sort of cognitively what's going on. Behaviorally, we see a lot of different types of responses to trauma. Some people avoid, right? Avoid anything that could be triggering. They sometimes socially isolate or withdraw. There's sometimes this like loss of interest or a lack of interest in things that you used to enjoy. And actually, one of the things he talks about in the book is that survivors of trauma have difficulty sometimes experiencing pleasure or joy, and that has to do with sort of this disconnection that they are experiencing between the mind and the body, right? There literally is like a disconnect. And so he talks about basically the ways that trauma changes the brain, it changes the body, and changes that mind-body connection. And there's so much to say here. Like it's like I don't know, should I go into it? But I'll just share a little bit about this before we move on to talk a little bit about sort of how do we heal from trauma, right? So one of the things that we know is that that trauma really affects our brain's ability to like pay attention to and interpret the signals around us, because we're essentially constantly in a state of fight or flight, right? So our body is trying to protect us essentially from danger, but we're misinterpreting signals around us after that traumatic experience so that almost everything feels like a threat. And what we find is that not only that, but so there's this sort of difficulty, like again, interpreting and responding to possible danger signals, but also we have trouble, so individual survivors of trauma have trouble with like recognizing and engaging and describing their own emotional states. Again, there's like a disconnect between sort of mind and the emotional self, and the physical self, right? And so sometimes it's really challenging to even like socially engage with other people. I'll talk about the social engagement system and what that is in a bit. But essentially he's saying, you know, trauma is interfering with our body's ability to manage and recover from stress responses, from the fight, flight, or freeze signals. I'm just reading. Oh, Vanessa, thank you for sharing that. I'm just reading what you wrote. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that, gosh, you know, it sounds like you've experienced a huge loss with the loss of your mom. You know, I think that when we've experienced loss, when we've experienced trauma, that there is this, again, it's like we struggle to sometimes manage just like our basic functions, right? Sort of these activities of daily living, sleeping, eating, you know, digestion. Our immune system is thrown off. There are so many things that we're just not even necessarily aware of. A lot of times, the other thing that we see is that, you know, in addition to sort of trauma disrupting our ability to know what we're feeling and to like trust our inner sort of knowing, our gut feeling, there's also, again, this sort of almost like a numbed inability to connect with like our physical sensations, literally like our senses, our sense of touch, taste, smell, but also with our emotions and with our thoughts, right? And so there's just, again, it's almost like sometimes we're going through our day or experiencing the world, if we've been it's sort of triggered by something in our outer world or even our inner world, and we are just feeling like we are going through the motions. It's like we're not, almost like there's a little bit of a dissociation that's happened. Dissociation is sort of this disconnect where you've, trauma survivors, as a way to cope with the intense pain of what they're experiencing, right? There's almost just sort of removal, this disconnection from self, like you're watching yourself in a movie, like you're sort of observing things that are happening to you, but you're not living the experience. I don't know if that makes sense, but again, just trauma is so disruptive to our mind-body emotional experience, right? And so what this looks like, I mean, how we see this translated physically, is that we see, survivors of trauma struggle with insomnia, struggle with, obviously, again, like increased heart rate, because they're perceiving everything as a threat, right? Or misperceiving signals as threats, and therefore their body's going into this constant state of fight or flight. And often, sometimes there's this experience of like chronic pain, right? So there's sort of survivors of trauma report complaints of feeling like aches and pains throughout the body. They're always on the lookout for danger. So there's this like intense sort of extreme alertness and edginess, almost irritability that's there. Often like exhausted, truly like, just fatigued, and easily startled. So you might be sort of jumpy, right? And then psychologically too, there's depressive symptoms that we start to see. Again, that social isolation, sort of this like overwhelming fear. Sometimes it plays out, the fear, keeps us in that fight or flight state, but it plays out as either this like emotional numbing, like we're numb essentially to our emotional experiences, or the reason that some survivors of trauma may turn to self-harm behaviors, right, is, yes, and Vanessa, thank you, Diane, for saying that. Well, and I just want to comment, Vanessa, on what you said too. I wasn't able to see the bottom part of that comment until now. And yeah, I mean, it sounds like, yeah, I'm just sort of in what you said, you're feeling some, almost like, oh, it wasn't your mom. Oh, okay. Oh, sister, you've had a lot going on. But what I'm getting is just that, yeah, it sounds like there's almost sort of a sense of like not feeling worthy of these resources, not feeling like you deserve to use and access the resources, or maybe you're feeling isolated and disconnected from those resources. And thank you for sharing about this. I mean, I'm seeing, yeah, gosh, there's been a lot of loss in your life. And so you yourself may have experienced some of these things, right? Like I again, coming back to some of these sort of psychological manifestations, what we see is sometimes there is just this detachment, right? This guilt or this shame that a person experiences, especially if they're feeling disconnected from other people. And that was a huge takeaway from this book, is he keeps talking about that if we are not feeling safe in our own body, we cannot connect to other people, right? And so I'll talk in a moment about sort of what do we do with that? Like, how do we reconnect to ourselves? And the last thing I wanted to just share is that, trauma can manifest in these different ways, right? So for some of us, there's this like fight response. Obviously it's like we're literally fighting off that stressor, or that trauma. But what it looks like is sometimes that person becomes very angry, explosive, controlling, narcissistic, almost like they're in self-preservation mode all the time, as opposed to like when we go into more of a flight response, that person becomes more of like needing to be in control. So the flight is running away from the stressor, but sometimes that manifests almost in this perfectionism, this heightened anxiety or OCD or panic, almost like somebody who is like a workaholic, just doing, and they're just sort of in this mode of not really, almost avoidance of stressors, as opposed to, right, so there's fight and flight, which our body initially goes into, but if that doesn't activate, if that's not working, then we move into like a freeze or a fawn response, right? And so the freeze is literally like immobilization. We can't move because we're feeling so, again, sort of traumatized by what's happening. And so this person may go into sort of this place of feeling, again, dissociated, disconnected. You might have trouble making decisions or feeling kind of numb or stuck or isolated. And then the last behavioral response, sometimes it plays out as sort of fawning, almost like our body is kind of like fainting or like playing dead almost as a way to just survive, right? It's sort of this way our nervous system sort of collapses in a sense. And this is actually, this plays out as someone who might be people pleasing, right? The please and appease kind of strategy to manage and to survive that stressor. So sometimes individuals who, use this, who go into this fawn response, maybe have very little boundaries. They might be highly codependent or conflict avoidant, and often sort of feeling overwhelmed and like they don't know who they are. And so there's, each one of these is just a different type of response, but it all stems essentially from our nervous system, right? Our autonomic nervous system. So I always like to talk about, we've got our central nervous system, like our brain and our spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system is everything else that's in the body, right? All the nerves that run throughout the body. And it's the autonomic nervous system that breaks into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, right? That's the autonomic part. The automatic controls all the automatic things we don't even think about: heart rate, breathing, digestion, right? And so again, it's like the sympathetic nervous system is that accelerator. It sort of speeds everything up, right? Sending us into that fight or flight, or even sometimes the freeze or fawn response. But the parasympathetic is the brakes, right? The parasympathetic slows down essentially that fight or flight response. But sometimes, again, it's like if our nervous system has experienced trauma, essentially there's like this misinterpretation of signals, which is why we may go into the freeze or the fawn response. So it's a little, again, it's a little complicated, but there's two things I wanted to say. I think it can be very common for individuals who have experienced trauma to have what's called PTSD, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of the symptoms I've described so far, that is what individuals with PTSD experience: feeling easily startled or frightened, always being on guard for danger. You have difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, sometimes self-destructive behavior, right? As opposed to either there's sort of this numbing behavior, or a person wants to just feel and sense and feel something. And sometimes that plays out in sort of these self-harm or self-destructive ways, whether that's like drinking too much or driving too fast or literally harming the body. Some other symptoms of PTSD: increased irritability and anger and aggressive behavior. And again, this sort of overwhelming guilt or shame. And I mentioned as well sort of the flashbacks or the nightmares, right? And so the thing that I want to say about that, though, and I'll talk about what are some ways to heal that. What's interesting is that nearly 50% of trauma survivors actually experience what's called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is basically where there are these positive changes that the person experiences as a result of this awful adversity that's happened in their life, right? And in other words, they may still go into their body physically experiences many of those PTSD-like symptoms, but over time, through sort of this whether they're moving through, like they've got social support, they're educating themselves, there's this emotional regulation they're learning. Also, by learning how to like reframe the narrative, right? This is where it's so important for somebody who has experienced trauma. So Vanessa, I'm not sure if you've engaged with therapy in any way, but that can be so helpful. I'm reading what you wrote now, where you said you're sharing because you feel like you have nobody to talk to. Well, let's connect, sister. I'd love to support you in this. I'm just, again, still reading. Yeah. I'm just saying you're feeling, well, let's talk. I would really love to connect with you. And I feel like, I know it's feeling like all hope is lost, but it's not. And, I think that part of, again, coming back to this is that in order to move from that place of post-traumatic stress into more of a post-traumatic growth, there needs to be a connection. So if you're feeling isolated, that's going to perpetuate sort of staying in that trauma response, but there is support available. And that's what I want you to know, is that you're not alone. There are so many others in this group that are and have experienced trauma and are feeling, maybe similar things to what you're feeling, Vanessa. And so know that you're not alone. I'm going to reach out to you after this so that we can connect. But again, it's like if we don't have those protective factors of that social support, or we don't have sort of others to disclose our experience to and to feel connected to, then we do sort of stay stuck in that trauma response. And so what I wanted to talk about are some of the healing strategies that he mentions in this book. There are many, but I like to break it down just to understand the difference between sort of a top-down and a bottom-up sort of processing, essentially, right? So like a top-down model of healing trauma is basically, so like if we use the hand model of the brain, right? This is sort of the easiest way I can explain it. So if this is your brain, right? And the bottom part of the brain is like the brainstem, where all of our sort of primitive, survival functions, our heart rate, our breathing, our respiration, digestion, like all the things we don't even think about that happen automatically that are controlled there. If your thumb that's sort of tucked in, that's your limbic system. This is the emotional brain, right? And then the part that wraps over it, this is the prefrontal cortex that sits behind the forehead. So the idea is that a top-down approach to treating trauma is essentially going to activate our prefrontal cortex, because it's going to require us to do some essentially like talk therapy, some thinking, so I'll talk a little bit about, so in therapy, right, like cognitive behavioral therapy or even some dialectical behavioral therapy are this sort of top-down approach, because we are working with that prefrontal cortex. We're using like rational logical thought, right? And we're processing what's happened. But here's the problem with top-down processing. Basically with, what he's saying is that when we are in a place of trauma, when we're in the trauma response, essentially like trauma responses are not logical. So Vanessa, everything that you were just describing, like from an outside perspective, or even for yourself, it may be feeling like you are feeling alone. You are feeling all of these things. And you're not able, what I'm hearing is that like you're not able to get to that sort of more rational logical thought right now, because your body is still in that trauma response, right? And we're in the emotional brain, and that's sort of the irrational center of our brain, right? And so what we need then is to actually understand that trauma is an embodied experience, right? And so essentially the bottom up technique for treating trauma is going to directly access that emotional brain. So it's going to actually target sort of our sensory receptors that are located throughout the body by accessing that emotional part of the brain. And, we know that trauma is stored in the body. It's stored in the viscera, right? And, oh, Vanessa, I can't even imagine. You've had so much loss. My goodness. 10 years ago, you lost your son, right? And so I honestly, I can't imagine. And what I know is that you're still here, right? And clearly you're incredibly resilient. I know, I hear you, sister, you're feeling alone, but you're not alone, right? Like we're here with you and absolutely want to support you in this. And to be honest, that's why I created this circle, because I don't want women to feel alone in what they're going through. And so what's important to understand is that in order to start to basically get a better sense of healing some of that trauma response, we actually have to almost like get into and reset the trauma related sort of emotional and sensory states that are stored within that emotional center, that limbic system. And so what we can do, this is actually exercise, is a bottom up treatment and approach. Rhythmic movement, EMDR, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's reprocessing. Diaphragmatic breathing actually is a bottom-up treatment, because what it's doing, and I'll talk about the vagus nerve in a moment, but we actually have this, really incredible tool within all of us, and it's the vagus nerve. And what that does basically is when we take deep, slow inhalations, but specifically a long exhalation breath, what that does is it actually sends a signal to the brain that slows down the fight or flight response, that emotional brain. And what it does is it actually activates the parasympathetic, the relaxation response. So that's why, like, if you're having a panic attack or you're feeling really anxious and people are telling you take these sort of slower, deeper breaths, what that does is it literally allows your body to sort of calm that fight or flight state and activate more of that relaxation, rest and digest state. And so what that actually does is it increases what's called your heart rate variability. And what we want, so heart rate variability just means that it's the interval between your heartbeats. And if we're in a panicked, anxious state, or we're feeling afraid, we're in a fear, right? We're going to have this rapid heart rate. We're going to have increased breathing. We're in that fight or flight response. But slowing the breathing, deeper exhalation breaths, right? The vagus nerve, again, innervates the diaphragm. So a deep exhalation expands the diaphragm and allows that message to go to the brain to slow that fight or flight response, right? And so, so the thing that is so interesting though, right, because I wanted to talk about yoga and why yoga actually can be so healing for trauma survivors. And that's, to be honest, why I selected this book, is because Bessel van der Kolk, did several studies using yoga as a therapeutic intervention. And the reason that works is basically yoga is one tool that uses both top-down and bottom-up processing simultaneously. So it essentially is restoring balance between the rational brain and the emotional brain. And it actually, the part that is so powerful is that it's accessing the emotional brain through this process called interoception. And interoception basically is integrating, it's sort of our awareness of our internal state. And when we've experienced trauma, our awareness of our internal state, we're not connected to our internal state. We feel disconnected, right? And so what we want is actually to reintegrate our bodily sensations and thoughts and feelings, and learn how to use that process of like interoceptive awareness basically to heighten our ability to feel connected to ourselves, which then allows us to feel more connected to others, right? Rainbow, thank you. And Diane, thank you guys. I mean, Vanessa, I hope you're reading these comments and just knowing that you're not alone, and that there's a lot of us that are sending you a lot of love right now, and just that you can feel that. Thank you. So, and here's the great irony of what I want to talk about next, which is, so the thing that's so mind-blowing to me from this book, and again, there's a lot of heady stuff in this book, but the thing that is such a big takeaway is that what Bessel van der Kolk talks about, and this actually comes from Stephen Porges as well, who created polyvagal theory, but basically what they're saying is that we actually have a third nervous system, which this is kind of mind-blowing, right? So we've got the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest relaxation response. But they're basically saying, well, wait a minute, we've actually got this third nervous system that's called the social engagement system that uses the face and the voice and language to mitigate threats. So essentially it's like, one of the things that Bessel van der Kolk says in this book is he says trauma devastates the social engagement system. It interferes essentially with your sort of cooperation and nurturing and the ability to function as a productive member of society, because, and this is why so many people turn to like substances or self-injurious behavior. Basically, he's saying that many mental health problems start with trauma. And it's basically the person is feeling such unbearable pain, Vanessa, kind of like what you're describing, essentially because there's a lack of like adequate support and human contact. And so basically he's saying the more scared we are, the more we have a need for companionship. And actually everything I've read about like addiction research within the last, I don't know, 10 years, for example, 5 years, there's more and more research that actually, connection is one of the greatest protective factors for individuals who struggle with addiction. So I've shared so much. I was going to go a little bit more in depth. I wanted to just share though I did talk about the vagus nerve because that was the fourth question from our live or our book club was, what is the vagus nerve and how is it connected to healing trauma? But what I wanted to say about this is that there are really simple ways that you can stimulate the vagus nerve. So super simple strategies to basically get your body a little bit more, basically you're building sort of an adaptability to stress so that you're able to almost transition from that fight or flight into that sort of rest and digest response a little bit more easily. So simple things, right? Meditation is one. We mentioned exercise, that's one. Actually, so contrast showers, right? So basically, taking like a hot warm shower, 3 minutes of a hot shower with 1 minute of cool or cold water. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio. My sense of why that works is because if you've ever noticed when you take a cold shower, generally there's this like deep sigh that comes as a result. And what that does, again, is stimulate the vagus nerve. So that's that where deeper, slower exhalations are going to stimulate the vagus nerve and help your body shift more into that relaxation. Same is true though with, so another technique is like singing, chanting, humming, gargling. One of my favorite breaths that I've taught in yoga is called bee's breath. And it's almost like the same kind of humming sound that you would make if you were oming. And it's literally what that does is, again, it's stimulating the vagus nerve. So it sounds like this. I'll do bee's breath for you. It's incredibly calming. So wherever you are, if you want to take a really deep inhalation, and on the exhalation, you're going to make sort of a humming sound in the back of the throat with the mouth closed. Do that a few times. It's super connecting and very, very grounding, and it's going to stimulate that relaxation response. So some of the other techniques, again, you can use for stimulating your vagus nerve naturally, and there are ways to do it sort of artificially to stimulate the vagus nerve, but naturally, belly laughter, right? So again, there's got to be that social connection, safe social connection that's there. But the strategies that I teach, restorative yoga and yoga nidra, are two of the simplest tools to allow your body to, again, shift from that fight or flight into a relaxation response, right? If you're interested, or if you don't know much about restorative yoga or yoga nidra, go to my website, aboundingcircles.com, and check out the resources page. I have a free yoga nidra that's an 8-minute and a 30-minute, 28-minute one that you can do. It is such an incredible practice. It's basically yogic sleep, and it will put you into a profound state of relaxation. They say 1 hour of yoga nidra is as beneficial, excuse me, as 4 hours of regular sleep for your body. And the restorative poses that I teach are basically, again, and there's on that resources page, you can see 6 different restorative yoga poses. But again, the whole idea here is that when we allow our body to slow down, rather than be in that like overworking, over committing, sort of that go, go, go response, which can be a trauma response, when we allow ourselves to slow down and to take deep breaths and to meditate and to be more in sort of like a, feeling connected to our body, it changes everything. It changes the trauma response. And that basically is polyvagal theory. This whole idea, what I've been describing is again, that, if our vagus nerve is receiving information that our environment is safe and secure, then we activate our social engagement system, and we're experiencing, basically, right, we then experience a calmer heart rate, our breathing slows down, we can freely use our vocal and facial expressions to connect with others. But if we're perceiving that our environment is unsafe, it's triggering the fight or flight response. And if that system fails, it's triggering the freeze or fawn response, right? And this then makes the person much less able to sort of relate to the world socially, because their social engagement system is shut down. And so, and I wanted to quote Bessel Kolk, because he says, being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. He says safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives, right? So the last couple things I wanted to just share about are essentially like why yoga can be so helpful in healing trauma. So partially, right, we're talking about social support and feeling connected to other people. I think that I'm just reading some of my notes here. Gosh, there's like so much that I want to say. Well, I'll say this because I've been talking about social support. So he says social support is not the same as merely being in the presence of others. That basically he's saying what we need is to be truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we are held in someone else's mind and heart. So for our physiology to calm down and heal and grow, we need a visceral, like a bodily sort of feeling of safety. And and right, we can't write a prescription for that. No doctor can write a prescription for friendship and love and like truly being seen and connected. That's something that we have to create for ourselves. And that's why actually, you know, group therapy or group, sort of that group model can be so healing for individuals who have had trauma, because we feel less alone when we hear other people's stories, when we get to share our story, right? So I'm a big believer in sort of the group process as a way to heal trauma. But I wanted to mention, this is the last thing. So the last question was, what is the insula, and how does basically yoga stimulate the insula or support the insula to help survivors of trauma to heal? So the insula is this very small area that's located on either side of the within the brain, within the brain. And it's almost like a receiving zone, essentially, for like reading our internal state. So remember that interoception or interoceptive awareness I was talking about? That is actually what's processed in the insula. So the insula like gives rise to sort of our basic emotions, to moral intuition, to empathy, to the capacity, this is interesting, to respond emotionally to music. Again, basically, it's our awareness of our internal bodily states, whether we're talking about the perception of pain or hunger or thirst or muscle aches or our heartbeat or sort of even our body temperature, our cravings, right? Rainbow, I'm just reading, you said how to create safety within. Yeah, helping a client find that within. Yes, as you love on a client more to model that. Yeah, I totally agree with you. So what we want is to create a sense of safety within, right? And so the insula is interestingly also responsible for our addictive habits. We think that when there's damage to the insula, that could be partly what's responsible for OCD and for addictive behaviors. But the other thing I wanted to say is, again, when trauma damages the insula and impacts the insula, and what that can create is this sort of loss of like bodily awareness. Like there's just like almost like our bodily sensations feel muted or numbed almost. And what we want then is to help survivors of trauma to reconnect to their body, right? Rainbow, you're saying that you have a client who wants to see safety from the outside and doesn't have many friends. Yeah, and where I would go with that is actually that client probably needs to create safety internally first, right? We need to feel safe within the body in order to then be able to connect and feel safe with other people. And trauma really disrupts our ability to know what we feel and to trust ourselves, trust our gut, which is why often individuals who have experienced trauma can feel very sort of apathetic, or they may experience sort of like, again, this difficulty perceiving sensation, experiencing touch and taste and smell, you know? And so what we want to do, right, is we actually want to create opportunities for co-regulation. Yes, I'm going to share an embodiment. Basically, Rainbow, you're asking what specific tools to create a sense of safety within. Anything that's an embodiment practice is a way to create safety within. And what I mean by that is essentially breathing techniques and breath work, yoga nidra, yoga itself, restorative yoga. Hang on, let me jump down to this. Even like a simple grounding practice, Rainbow, of like something I see. So like the five senses, something I see in this moment, something I hear in this moment, something I taste, touch, smell, right? Because what we want is for that person to begin to practice connecting to their senses as a way to experience the world and experience safety in their sensations. But one of the things we know is that that doesn't just happen through talking. That's not, because that would be the top-down approach. It actually has to be a felt experience, right? And so I'm going to share this one last quote from Bessel because I love this. He says, if you have a comfortable connection with your inner sensations, if you can trust them to give you accurate information, you will feel in charge of your body, your feelings, and yourself. However, he says, traumatized people chronically feel unsafe in their bodies. People who cannot comfortably notice what's going on inside become vulnerable to respond to any sensory shift by either shutting down or going into a panic. They develop basically a fear of fear itself. And so self-regulation then depends on having a friendly relationship with your body. And so how do you do that? We want to allow that person to, one, start to move their body in safe ways, right? This is where, again, like rhythmic movement can be really helpful. That's an embodiment practice. tapping would be a tool that could help a person sort of feel a little bit more connected to their own body. Also, so here, I'm going to just share, let me see if there's anything else I was going to end with just a quick sort of embodiment practice and tool. Is there anything else I wanted to, oh, really like, yeah, so I was just going to say that other ways to build that interoceptive awareness, mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is one way to do that. Meditation is another way to do that. So part of like yoga and why that's so powerful is that, and it's so interesting, there have been studies that they've looked at the effect of yoga on like individuals with eating disorders, and they found that actually when all other factors were controlled for, and they've done this study with depressed individuals too, and they found that actually yoga reduced the depressive symptoms and reduced some of the body dysmorphia and the eating disorder symptoms. And the reason why we think that works is because yoga, if you think about like what happens during a yoga practice, right? If you're with sort of a skilled teacher, you're going to be guided as you're moving through like different yoga poses. They're going to sort of walk you through, notice what's coming up for you in that downward dog. Notice how your body is feeling in whatever the restorative pose that you're in, or the child's pose, or warrior two. Like we're constantly building basically interoceptive awareness as we are prompting. So Rainbow, a technique might be to sort of prompt your client a little bit as they're moving through whatever the embodiment practice is just notice that. Notice what's happening for you. I say this a lot when I teach yoga. Notice what's happening in the mind, right? Is the mind chattering? Is the mind wandering? What's happening in the body? Are there any places in the body that are holding tension, right? And often I'll use breathing as a way. With each exhale, we release that tension. With each inhale, we ground, we feel connected to ourself, right? So the idea is, again, that like the more that we can start to pay attention to what's going on within like our internal experience, that's going to help that person feel safe in their body. That's going to help them then be able to engage that, to activate that social engagement system. So here's a simple embodiment practice, right? And maybe let's do this together. Like, let's take a moment and close the eyes, and we'll just take a few deep breaths together. And just notice your inhale breath as it moves in through the nose, traveling down the spine, filling the low belly. And as we exhale the breath, right, we can release through the nose or the mouth, but we might visualize that breath leaving the body and taking with it anything that's not serving us, right? So again, with each inhale, we're feeling that breath move all the way into the low belly. And with each exhale, we're releasing any tension or stress or anxiety or thoughts that are not serving us. We release that with the exhale breath. And as you're doing this simple breathing, just notice what's happening within your body, right? Notice any physical sensations. Notice what's arising for you on sort of like a physical level. Is there any changes, any in the tightness or tingly sensations, or sort of a heaviness, an achiness? Notice how your shoulders are feeling, right? If the shoulders are up by the ears, can we take the shoulders down back and sit a little bit taller, right? So sometimes, and this is the beauty of like a yoga practice, is there are these subtle adjustments that we can make. We don't even realize that our shoulders are up by the ears, right? But we can just release the shoulders down as we take a deep exhalation. And just as we're connecting and noticing our body, right, let's ask ourselves, what does our body need to be nourished in this moment? So just that simple question. What does your body need to be nourished? And then as we're continuing to just breathe in and breathe out, be in that exhale and inhale breath. Notice what emotions are coming up for you, right? Even during this live, notice what emotions have come up for you, and see if you can name them or describe them just like silently to yourself. And just identifying, actually that act of identifying our emotional experience, right? That's that name it to tame it. That if we can start to name our emotions, that actually slows the fight or flight and activates the relaxation response because we're more in our prefrontal cortex. So can we just name how we're feeling in this moment? And ask ourselves, like, what does our heart need to be fed with support and joy? What does your heart need in this moment to be fed with support and joy? And then as we're continuing with the eyes closed, to just notice the inhale and the exhale breath, and notice where we're, currently sitting. Can we just feel the support of whatever we're sitting on? Noticing the points of contact with the body and the chair or the bed or the couch or the floor. And noticing, like, what are the quality of our thoughts in this moment? Right? Are our thoughts loving thoughts? Are they supportive thoughts? Or are we being self-critical in this moment? And can we ask ourselves, like, what does our mind need to be free and clear and supportive and compassionate to ourselves? So I'm a really big fan of just using a very simple I am practice, and that's another simple embodiment practice. As we inhale, we just mentally repeat the word I, and as we exhale, we repeat am. I am. And you might notice, right, maybe there's a thought that comes up. It could be a self-critical thought. I am, whatever the word is that comes up. Or maybe it's a loving thought. I am brave. I am courageous. I am. We don't even have to be anything. We can just be. That's the beauty of that simple inhale, exhale practice of I am. In yoga, we would use the Sanskrit word so as we inhale and hum as we exhale. So hum. And so this last part of our embodiment practice is just to, from this place of breathing in and breathing out, take a moment to cultivate gratitude in the heart space. Just feeling grateful for being present here in this moment, feeling connected to the women that are within our circle, or within all of, some of us have multiple circles, right? Allowing there to be gratitude for being here and present and showing up for ourselves. And maybe asking ourselves, what does our soul, our spirit need to be at peace? Right? If we've really never addressed some of our trauma, where do we need to start to create a sense of peace within, and safety really, within our own experience, within our body, within our mind, within our spirit? And so if you have watched this, if you are finding yourself feeling alone or isolated or disconnected, I truly would love to connect with you. Like I would love that. And I would love to connect you with the resources that I think you might be needing to give you the support that you are needing in this moment. And so whenever you feel ready, right, from that place of just like being in gratitude and connecting to what we're needing, we can open the eyes and just come back to the space. And I invite you guys, from this point, feel free to reach out to each other. If there are things that others have written in the comments and you want to just offer some words of support and to let them know that they're not alone, please feel free to do that. And again, please reach out to me. I will certainly reach out to some of you and want to be able to just offer some of the practices that I teach that might be able to support you. I will say this, I am not trained in treating trauma. there are really specific techniques that a person might need to be trained in, and not just these embodiment practices, though certainly these are so incredibly helpful. But if we're talking therapeutically, like EMDR and brain spotting, there are some of us in this circle who are trained in treating trauma. And, you know, if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to direct you to individuals within our circle who might be able to answer those specific questions. But I hope that you guys have just sort of gained something and learned, you know, through this live. There's a lot here with this book. And so I appreciate you guys for just being here with me. And, you know, whether you've been reading this book on your own or you just wanted to catch the live, thank you for being here. And I did want to just share, I'll be announcing our book for next month. We're gonna sort of change gears a little bit. So next month we're actually going to be reading another one of Emily Nagoski's books, which I have to say, you guys, I have been waiting to share this book with the circle. It's an incredible book and it's incredibly empowering. The book is Come As You Are, and it's the surprising new science that will transform your sex life. And she actually wrote this book first before she wrote the book Burnout. And I really love this book. Can't wait for you guys to read this. Can't wait to do the live on it and to basically be able to share so many things that I think will be so reassuring and validating to so many women around both our like sexual response cycle as well as our stress response cycle. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a beautiful day, and I look forward to connecting with you all further. Okay, aloha.